Special Duties by Graham Greene. William Ferraro of Ferraro and Smith lived in a great house in Montague Square. One wing was occupied by his wife, who believed herself to be an invalid and obeyed strictly the dictate that one should live every day as if it were one's last. For this reason, her wing, for the last 10 years, had invariably housed some Jesuit or Dominican priest with a taste for good wine and whiskey and an emergency bell in his bedroom. Mr. Ferraro looked after his salvation in more independent fashion. He retained the firm grasp on practical affairs that had enabled his grandfather, who had been a fellow exile with Mazzini, to found the great business of Ferraro and Smith in a foreign land. God had made man in his image, and it was not unreasonable for Mr. Ferraro to return the compliment, to regard God as the director of some supreme business which yet depended, for certain, on its operations on Ferraro and Smith. The strength of a chain is in its weakest link, and Mr. Ferraro did not forget his responsibility. Before leaving his office at 9:30, Mr. Ferraro, as a matter of courtesy, would telephone to his wife in the other wing. "Father Dew's speaking," a voice would say. "How is my wife?" "She passed a good night." The conversation seldom varied. There had been a time when Father Dew's predecessor made an attempt to bring Mr. and Mrs. Ferraro into a closer relationship, but he had desisted when he realized how hopeless his aim was, and how, on the few occasions when Mr. Ferraro dined with them in the other wing, an inferior claret was served at table, and no whiskey was drunk before dinner. Mr. Ferraro, having telephoned from his bedroom where he took his breakfast, would walk, rather as God walked in the garden, through his library lined with the correct classics, and his drawing room, on the walls of which hung one of the most expensive art collections in private hands, where one man would treasure in a single Degas, Renoir, Cezanne. Mr. Ferraro bought wholesale. He had 6 Renoirs, 4 Degas, 5 Cezannes. He never tired of their presence. They represented a substantial saving in death duties. On this particular Monday morning, it was also May the 1st. The sense of spring had come punctually to London, and the sparrows were noisy in the dust. Mr. Ferraro, too, was punctual, but unlike the seasons, he was as reliable as Greenwich time. With his confidential secretary, a man called Hopkinson, he went through the schedule for the day. It was not very onerous, for Mr. Ferraro had the rare quality of being able to delegate responsibility. He did this the more readily because he was accustomed to make unexpected checks, and woe betide the employee who failed him. Even his doctor had to submit to a sudden counter-check from a rival consultant. "I think," he said to Hopkinson, "this afternoon I will drop in to Christie's and see how Maverick is getting on." Maverick was employed as his agent in the purchase of pictures. What better could be done on a fine May afternoon than check on Maverick? He added, "Send in Miss Saunders." "Send in Miss Saunders," and drew forward a personal file which even Hopkinson was not allowed to handle. Miss Saunders moused in. She gave the impression of moving close to the ground. She was about 30 years old, with indeterminate hair and eyes, and a startling clear blue, which gave her otherwise anonymous face a resemblance to a holy statue. She was described in the firm's books as assistant confidential secretary, and her duties were special ones. Even her qualifications were special. She had been head girl at the convent of St. Latitudinaria, working where she had won 3 successive years the special prize for piety, a little triptych of Our Lady with a background of blue silk, bound in Florentine leather and supplied by Burns, Oakes, and Washburn. She also had a long record of unpaid service as a child of Mary. "Miss Saunders," Mr. Ferraro said, "I find no account here of the indulgences to be gained in June." "I have it here, sir. I was late home last night, as the plenary indulgence at St. Etheldreda's entailed the Stations of the Cross." She had a typed list on Mr. Ferraro's desk. In the first column, the date; in the second, the church or place of pilgrimage where the indulgence was to be granted; and in the third column, in red ink, the number of days saved from the temporal punishments of purgatory. Mr. Ferraro read it carefully. "I get the impression, Miss Saunderson," "Oh, Miss Saunders," he said, "that you are spending too much time on the lower brackets. 60 days here, 50 days there. Are you sure you're not wasting your time on these? One indulgence of 300 days will compensate for many such. I noticed just now that your estimate for May is lower than your April figures, and your estimate for June is nearly down to the March level. 5 plenary indulgences for 1,565 days. Very good April work. I don't want you to slacken off."
"April is a very good month for indulgences, sir. There is Easter in May. We can depend only on the fact that it is Our Lady's month. June is not very fruitful, except at Corpus Christi. You will notice a little Polish church at Cambridgeshire.
As long as you remember, Miss Saunders, that none of us is getting younger. I put a great deal of trust in you, Miss Saunders. If I were less occupied here, I would attend to some of these indulgences myself. You pay great attention, I hope, to the conditions?"
"Of course I do, Mr. Ferraro."
"You are always careful to be in a state of grace?" Miss Saunders lowered her eyes.
"That is not very difficult in my case, Mr. Ferraro."
"What is your program today?"
"You have it there, Mr. Ferraro."
"Of course. St. Praxton's, Cannon Wood. That is a rather long way to go. You have to spend the whole afternoon in a mere 60 days on a mere 60 days indulgence."
"It was all I could find for today. Of course, there are always the plenary indulgences at the cathedral, but I know how you feel about not repeating during the same month."
"My only point of superstition," said Mr. Ferraro said. "It has no basis, of course, in the teachings of the Church."
"You would like an occasional repetition for a member of your family, Mr. Ferraro? Your wife?"
"We are taught, Miss Saunders, to pay first attention to our own souls. My wife should be looking after her own indulgences. She has an excellent Jesuit adviser. I implore you to look after mine."
"You have no objection to Cannon Wood?"
"If it is really the best you can do, so long as it does not involve overtime."
"Oh, no, Mr. Ferraro. A decade of the Rosary, that's all."
After an early lunch, a simpler one, in a city chop house, which concluded with some Stilton and a glass of excellent port, Mr. Ferraro visited Christie's. Maverick was satisfactorily on the spot, and Mr. Ferraro did not bother to wait for the Bonnard and the Monet, which his agent had advised him to buy. The day remained warm and sunny, but there were confused sounds from the direction of Trafalgar Square, which reminded Mr. Ferraro that it was Labor Day. There was something inappropriate in the sun and the early flowers under the park trees, and these processions of men without ties, carrying dreary banners covered with bad lettering. A desire came to Mr. Ferraro to take a real holiday, and he nearly told his chauffeur to drive to Richmond Park. But he always preferred, if it were possible, to combine business with pleasure, and it occurred to him that if he drove out now to Cannon Wood, Miss Saunders should be arriving about the same time after her lunch interval to start the afternoon's work. Cannon Wood was one of those new suburbs built around an old estate. The estate was a public park. The house, formerly famous as the home of a minor minister who served under Lord North at the time of the American Rebellion, was now a local museum, and a street had been built on a little windy hilltop, once a 100-acre field. A Charrington coal agency, the window dressed with one large nugget in a metal basket, a home and colonial stores, an Odeon cinema, a large Anglican church. Mr. Ferraro told his driver to ask the way to the Roman Catholic Church. "There isn't one here," the policeman said. "St. Praxton's?" "There's no such place," the policeman said. Mr. Ferraro, like a biblical character, felt a loosening of his bowels. "St. Praxton's, Cannon Wood, doesn't exist, sir," the policeman said. Mr. Ferraro drove slowly back toward the city. This was the first time he had checked on Miss Saunders. 3 prizes for piety had won his trust. Now, on his homeward way, he remembered that Hitler had been educated by the Jesuits, and yet, hopelessly, he hoped. In his office, he unlocked the drawer and took out the special file. Could he have mistaken Canonbury for Cannon Wood? But he had not been mistaken, and suddenly a terrible doubt came to him. How often in the last 3 years Miss Saunders had betrayed her trust. It was after a severe attack of pneumonia 3 years ago that he had engaged her. The idea had come to him during the long insomnias of convalescence. Was it possible that not one of these indulgences had been gained? He couldn't believe that. Surely a few of the vast total of 36,892 days must still be valid, but only Miss Saunders could tell him how much, or how many. And what had she been doing with her office time, those long hours of pilgrimage? She had once taken a whole weekend at Walsingham. He rang for Mr. Hopkinson, who could not help remarking on the whiteness of his employer's face. "Are you feeling quite all right, Mr. Ferraro? I have had a severe shock. Can you tell me where Miss Saunders lives?" "She lives with an invalid mother near Westbourne Grove." "The exact address, please." Mr. Ferraro drove into the dreary wastes of Bayswater. Great family houses that had been converted into private hotels, or fortunately bombed into car parks. In the terraces behind, dubious girls leant against the railings, and a street band blew harshly round a corner. Mr. Ferraro found the house, but he could not bring himself to ring the bell. He sat crouched in his Daimler, waiting for something to happen. Was it the intensity of his gaze that brought Miss Saunders to an upper window? A coincidence or retribution? Mr. Ferraro thought at first that it was the warmth of the day that had caused her to be so ineffectually clothed. As she slid the window a little wider, but then an arm circled her waist. A young man's face looked down into the street. A hand pulled the curtain across with the familiarity of habit. It became obvious to Mr. Ferraro that not even the conditions for an indulgence had been properly fulfilled. If a friend could have seen Mr. Ferraro that evening mounting the steps of Montague Square, he would have been surprised at the way he had aged. It was almost as though he had assumed during the long afternoon, those 36,892 days he had thought to have saved during the last 3 years from purgatory. The curtains were drawn, the lights were on, and no doubt Father Dews was pouring out the first of his evening whiskies in the other wing. Mr. Ferraro did not ring the bell, but let himself quietly in. The thick carpet swallowed his footsteps like quicksand. He switched on no lights, only a red-shaded lamp in each room had been lit ready for his use, and now guided his steps. The pictures in the drawing room reminded him of death duties. A great Degas bottom like an atomic explosion mushroomed above a bath. Mr. Ferraro passed on into the library. The leather-bound classics reminded him of dead authors. He sat down in a chair, and a slight pain in his chest reminded him of his double pneumonia. He was 3 years nearer death than when Miss Saunders was appointed first. After a long while, Mr. Ferraro knotted his fingers together in the shape some people use for prayer. With Mr. Ferraro, it was an indication of decision. The worst was over. Time lengthened again ahead of him. He thought, "Tomorrow I will set about getting a really reliable secretary." And that's the end.